His journey began in the midst of both faith and fear. For nearly 4 centuries, his people had been in Egypt, but now there was a new king who did not know their ancestor Joseph. Joseph, who had saved not only the great dynasty, but the entire region from starvation. His people were set to hard labor, and when they rose to the occasion, the labor was made even harder. And when that did not slow them down, the king ordered the babies, especially the male babies. Well, I think you know how that part of the story goes. Indeed, it was a time of great fear. The king was afraid of losing power, and the Israelites were afraid of the king. But the one thing that can overcome fear is faith. And the faith of Jochebed, his mother, Miriam, his sister, they trumped the fear that was running through their community. Their faith said that if they trusted this baby boy to God, God would care for and protect him. And so he was indeed protected and raised by the king's own daughter, who, despite knowing that he was a Hebrew baby, gave him an Egyptian name, Moses. Over the previous 9 weeks, we have followed all 120 years of Moses' life and ministry. There are not very many other figures in Scripture whom we cover from birth to death. The prophet Samuel is one, and Jesus is another. Moses exemplified faith and fear in his own life before and after God called him. Our Sunday readings skip the episode where he defends his own people and kills an Egyptian taskmaster. In fear of the king, he flees and finds a place to settle down, or so he thinks. In faith, he has a conversation with a flaming shrubbery, a burning bush, literally a plant that was on fire, and he spoke back to it. In fear, he tells God that he cannot possibly speak to Pharaoh because he has a stutter, and he thinks that neither Pharaoh nor the Israelites will believe anything he has to say. And then in faith, Moses says yes. Says yes to God because God promises and continues to promise and fulfill the promise that God will be with them and care for them the entire way. In faith and maybe a little fear, Moses begins his call to free the Hebrews from captivity in Egypt. God has heard the cry of the oppressed, and as always, God always hears those cries. And Pharaoh, as God promised, would see the full power of the Almighty. After experiencing 10 plagues, each worse than the one before, the Hebrew people are able to make their escape from Egypt and follow Moses towards the Promised Land, the land that was given to Abraham almost a millennium before. Moses had helped restore the people's faith in God's ability to do what God had promised. And they were at a point where they felt like they could trust God and trust Moses. The book of Exodus is widely regarded as having been written by Moses, or at least his account of things. So it's no surprise that when their faith wore thin and their fear grew, and they complained against God and Moses, Moses recorded all of it. Because each time they grumbled, God answered in faithfulness. God provided bread and meat. God provided water. God even provided rules by which to live. As much faith as Moses had in God, God had faith in Moses too. When the people rebelled and built a golden calf to worship, God was not amused. Perhaps the people forgot that whole first commandment about not having idols or other gods. And God was ready to wipe them off the face of the earth. He was so mad. But yet, God listened to Moses recount the promises made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. In faith and fear, Moses led the people through numerous entanglements with other nations, people on whose land God's people needed to be. When their faith was strong, they prevailed. But when their faith was not, when they relied on their own abilities and not on God, the results were not in their favor. Like most of us mere mortals, Moses had a weak moment in his faith. His patience wore thin. He did not do the one thing that God directed him to do. Instead of telling the rock to produce water, which is what God told Moses to do, Moses struck the rock with his staff, struck it out of frustration and anger, and said not nice things to his followers. It's all recorded in the 20th chapter of the book of Numbers. And God immediately tells Moses and Aaron that they will not be the ones to lead the people to the promised land. A harsh punishment, it seems, but God had gone to great lengths to have Moses show God's power and not Moses' power. God's use of Moses' staff, which had been with him since that burning bush, that use of that staff had changed over the course of their relationship. It began as a tool for instilling fear in Pharaoh and in the Egyptians. But after they crossed into freedom, it became a tool for showing Moses' faith in God and God's faithfulness to the people. So in the 27th chapter of Numbers, God reiterates the consequences for Moses' impatience. In a moment of humility that is worthy of repetition by all God's people, Moses simply asks for God to appoint someone whom the people will trust to lead them to the next phase to the promised land. Before Moses' earthly journey concludes, he blesses each of the 12 tribes of Israel. It's 2 chapters before what we heard today in Deuteronomy 32 and 33. And I found it to be some of the most beautiful poetry in all of Scripture. Moses' faith is complete. His fear is gone. He has seen God, and God knew him face to face. God cared for Moses from beginning to end, even taking care of his burial, a task which most often fell to one's family. In all of Scripture, the relationship between God and Moses is very special, but not unique. Plenty of people show their faith and fear as God calls them to be the hands, feet, and voice of God in a broken world. But Scripture is the story of God's people, and it is the story of how God worked in history as well. So the story of Moses is our story too. It is a story of a journey of faith and fear. I am certain that we could each think of a dozen or so times when we didn't turn to God, when we acted out of fear, and I bet those results weren't as happy for us as they might have been. Because I bet we could also think of a dozen or more times when we acted on faith, when we put our trust in God's guidance and protection. When Moses allowed his fear to triumph over things, those things did not turn out so well. But when he put his faith and trust in God, he was able to see all that God could and would do in his life and in the life of the Israelites. And I would dare say that the same is true for each of us.